Let's read Matthew chapter 25, verses 1 to 13 together. The story's called The Parable of the Wise and Foolish Virgins. Then the kingdom of heaven shall be likened to 10 virgins who took their lamps and went out to meet the bridegroom. Now 5 of them were wise, and 5 were foolish. Those who were foolish took their lamps and took no oil with them. But the wise ones took oil in their vessels with their lamps. But while the bridegroom was delayed, they all slumbered and slept. And at midnight a cry was heard, "Behold, the bridegroom is coming, go out to meet him." Then all those virgins arose and trimmed their lamps. And the foolish said to the wise, "Give us some of your oil, for our lamps are going out." But the wise answered, saying, "No, lest there should not be enough for us and you, but go rather to those who sell and buy for yourselves." And while they went to buy, the bridegroom came. And those who were ready went in with him to the wedding, and the door was shut. Afterward, the other virgins came also, saying, "Lord, Lord, open up to us." But he answered and said, "Assuredly I say to you, I do not know you. Watch, therefore, for you know neither the day nor the hour in which the Son of Man is coming." Now, what we've just heard read is one of the most interesting and at the same time most challenging of the parables that Jesus told to his disciples while he was in Jerusalem shortly before the crucifixion. A parable, you may remember, is just a simple story describing an ordinary, everyday event, but it contains a deeper spiritual lesson for those who are willing to be taught a lesson. That's why, after telling a parable, Jesus often said, "Let those who have ears hear." Jesus' teaching is for those who desire to learn from his teaching. So, what can we learn from the parable of the wise and foolish virgins? Well, first of all, let's quickly filter out the cultural issues so that we're not distracted by things that are difficult for us to appreciate in this day and age. So, in the Middle East, at the time of Jesus, bridesmaids were always young, single girls. That was just the established local tradition. And so the reasonable assumption was that these unmarried maidens would be virgins, and that's why they are described that way in the passage. But the point of the story has nothing to do with the marital condition of the girls themselves. So for the rest of this talk, let's simply refer to them as the bridesmaids. And in that way, we can concentrate on what the real point of the story is. The real point is the responsibility of the bridesmaids and the task that they were required to do. That's the main point of the parable. The responsibility of the bridesmaids and the task that they were required to do. The story teaches us that the wise ones acted correctly and they were welcomed into the feast. But the foolish ones failed in their duty and consequently they relinquished their reward. So, what was it that these bridesmaids had been asked to do? Well, in ancient Jewish culture, a man and a woman would become betrothed, or what we would call engaged. And then they would go off and continue to live separate lives until the wedding reception was perfectly prepared, which could be some considerable time later. But then when everything was ready, the bridegroom would return, traditionally at night time, and the bridesmaids would use their lamps to light the way to the bride's home, where the wedding ceremony would take place. And then, following the ceremony, the bride and the bridegroom would lead a grand procession from the bride's house all the way to the bridegroom's house for the feast. And once again, it would be the lamps of the bridesmaids that lit the way. Isn't that a lovely picture? But just imagine what would happen if the bridesmaids were negligent in their duty and there were no lamps ready to illuminate this wonderful event. What would that say about the love and respect, or lack of it, for the bridegroom? Because the bridegroom had arranged and paid for the banquet and all the festivities, and he had issued the kind invitation to the fortunate bridesmaids. And failure to do what had been asked of them would show a shameful lack of love and respect. But why was Jesus talking about a wedding in the first place? Well, to answer that question, we have to briefly turn back to chapter 24 of Matthew to find out what Jesus was teaching about immediately before he told the parable of the 10 bridesmaids. And we discover that he was revealing to his disciples that after he is crucified, and after he rises from the dead, and after he ascends to heaven, and after he sends the Holy Spirit, he will come again. Jesus will return to earth to reign in glory. And that's the basis of the wedding symbolism. Because just as there was a period of waiting between the engagement and the wedding feast, in the story, Jesus was telling his disciples that there would be an unspecified length of time until he returns. But he also tells them how they should wait, and that is really important. Let me read a few words to you from the end of Matthew chapter 24, because in verse 42, Jesus gives this command. He says, "Watch, therefore, for you do not know what hour your Lord is coming." And then he continues in verse 44, "Be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour that you do not expect him." Now those are the words of Jesus himself. And then he immediately goes on to tell a story which describes the fate of a worker who is given a task to do while his boss is away. But he fails to do it, and he's punished in a way that reminds us of the foolish bridesmaids who failed to keep their lamps burning. They all miss out on sharing in the reward of the glory of the one who returns when they are not ready. Now, at first glance, this parable seems fairly straightforward, doesn't it? Surely the wise bridesmaids are Christians and the foolish ones are non-Christians or unbelievers. But is it really that simple? Remember, Jesus is telling this story to his disciples, not to the general public. The foolish bridesmaids knew who the bridegroom was, and they had been invited to the banquet already, so they cannot be excused for lack of knowledge. They don't sound like unbelievers. And what's more, they had been given a task to carry out by the bridegroom himself that would ensure their inclusion at the festivities, so there was no misunderstanding over what they were required to do and what their reward would be. But for some reason, they simply didn't do what they had been asked to do. So the wise and foolish bridesmaids are not Christians and unbelievers. And that only leaves us one alternative, that the wise ones are obedient Christians and the others are disobedient Christians. All of them are believers who know Jesus and what he requires of us, but they each choose whether to live in accordance with his instructions or not. Perhaps the description foolish bridesmaids refers to those who get tired of waiting and become distracted or even lured away by the attractions of the world, when they ought to be watching closely and remaining prepared for the arrival of the bridegroom. When we believe in Jesus, we must commit to believing everything about him, including believing that he will come again and believing in the importance of the instructions he gives us to make sure that we're ready for his return. The passage seems to suggest that there is a depth of belief, a depth revealed by the believer's willingness to obey, which is an indication of whether or not the full gospel has been truly believed in the first place. In the parable, the wise bridesmaids were waiting for the bridegroom with eager anticipation. Their lamps were in tip-top condition, full of fuel and ready to light up the happy procession. Let's be sure that our hearts are right with God and filled to the brim with the oil of the Holy Spirit as we await the return of Jesus, which will be the most glorious celebration in all history for those who wisely prepare for his arrival. See you next time.